Okay, so welcome everybody. I see a lot of familiar faces. And for those of you who have been in the summer symposium, as well as the last session in September with matter, integrating matter and the scientific methods, welcome back. Today, if you're new, my name is Nicole Lamoureux, and I'm the consultant here with Alberta Regional Professional Development Consortium. And we're going to look at planning for integrating the scientific methods. And we're going to look at the example of energy, specifically the second cusp, how the behavior of light affects its path. Okay, and to begin, we're going to do a land acknowledgement. In the spirit of reconciliation, we want to acknowledge that this gathering is taking place on traditional lands across the province of Alberta, home to many diverse First Nations, Métis, and Inuit peoples. We acknowledge that this land is a traditional meeting ground, giving voice to its original peoples and the story of creation of this country in a way that history has forgotten. Okay. I'm using Canva, so it's a little bit finicky here. Okay, so for those of you who are joining, if you are in French, this will be translated in French. I may repeat that as I know some people are joining in. And the goals for today is we're going to begin by looking at our subject introduction for science in the new curriculum and really pulling out the pieces about the scientific methods. What does it mean? Where do we integrate? How do we integrate? And we're going to then look at some of the key verbs in the skills and procedures in the other organizing ideas. We're going to walk through a resource today. You're going to get a resource that's linked to lots of different resources, but it was something I put together, which is a planning guide resource that you will receive today. And if you're watching this online, it will be linked underneath. So the sample is the beginning plan for the behavior of light affects its path. So we've got you set up in some resources and some assessments and things like that you can take away and use in your classroom going forward. So in the last session, those of you who were with me, it was a think aloud process. Today, going on the gradual release of responsibility, it's a bit of a we do, a bit of an interactive piece of, planning together going forward. Okay. That doesn't mean online here, but kind of I'm going to get you started. Okay. So the information in this session, as well as the slides and the resources that were developed, are under what is called Creative Commons licensing. What that means is you're free to copy and redistribute the material in any medium or format. You can remix, transform, or build on this material. And so the certain stipulations are that when you share it out, that credit is given to ARPDC, and that is non-commercial, so it's not shared on a format such as Teachers Pay Teachers or anything like that. And share alike means that when you adapt or share out, that it's under the same conditions that the people recognize that, it's the credit is given and whatnot. So if you are a school or division leader, you can share the slides or information. Please just source ARPDC 2023 on the bottom. Okay. So I know that, we often align our sessions, but I will be referring back to this because as professionals, as teachers, we are professionals. We have quality standards that we adhere to. And so I did pull that out today, but we're going to refer back to this about demonstrating a body of knowledge that specifically in the area that a teacher applies a current and comprehensive repertoire of effective planning, instruction, and assessment practices that meet the learning needs of every student. So the subsections that I pulled out that we're going to refer back to is planning and designing learning activities that address the learning outcomes in our curriculum, and applying student assessment and evaluation practices that accurately reflect the learner outcomes within the curriculum. So we're going to kind of talk about that. And then I often see a lot of resources out in terms of sample lesson plans or scopes and sequences. But what I didn't really see, or a gap that I saw, was with medium range planning. And this is in our TQS as well. So that is something that we're expected to do, which is like a unit plan. Okay. So we're all learning together and we're in this together. And so I'm going to use the wisdom of Maya Angelou for this, is that we're doing the best we can. until we know better. And then when we know better, we do better. Okay, so no blame, shame, nothing. So the key ideas that I want you to walk away with today is that the scientific methods are, first of all, meant to be integrated into all other organizing ideas. Secondly, it is the way in which students should be building knowledge. And if you've been in my sessions, and we will unpack this again, but a little bit about the explore before explain, that whole idea of investigating first before we give the explanation, and we'll talk about that. Then we're going to talk about teacher clarity, taking the time, and kudos to you for coming today live, as well as those of you who are watching from home, that taking the time to unpack the curriculum empowers you as an educator to choose the activities and resources that truly align with the curriculum. And so from that, we're going to talk about sequencing the curriculum or progressions for that clarity to intentionally plan to align the scientific methods. And as well as the resource that you can take with you going forward, even though we use the sample of light, you can use this resource in other organizing areas to help you going forward to plan. Okay. So we're going to start with looking at the science curriculum subject introduction. It states the science curriculum engages students in active investigation to build scientific knowledge and develop critical thinking and problem-solving skills. And we're going to go beyond paying lip service to this. We're going to say, well, what does that really mean for students to build knowledge? And that students will have opportunities to integrate this into all other areas of the science curriculum. So let's look at, when you see the learning outcomes and all the other organizing ideas, in there, it's either starts with or has students investigate. And what was created for you in the planning guide or the planning document was a glossary for the verbs, for the science verbs in our skills and procedures. And that was with my ERLC as well as with our assessment consultant. So investigate is to use a process of inquiry to gain deeper understanding. Well, that process or procedures of an investigation are laid out in your grade 2 knowledge statements right here. So for students to build knowledge, they have to go through this process. And in the summer symposium, I have developed this graphic organizer to kind of help us that, it's not step by step, but it's an iterative cyclical process that our students are going to go through in order to build knowledge. So when I mention, and for those of you who are new, when I say explore before explain, that's going through the investigation cycle first, then being given and to be able to, for students to draw conclusions, right? They reflect on their recorded observations or data in order to make conclusions. And they have to confirm. They can't just kind of, I think this, it's let's confirm with what the science community says, or let's, in a video or a book, or the teacher can introduce something. That's the explain phase comes after. So instead of introducing with a video first, we want to do investigations first for a number of reasons. And we're going to talk about language and how that can inhibit not only ELL learners, but they're 7 years old or 8 years old in grade 2. They're developing their language. So sometimes introducing with a video first can interfere with their learning, and we're going to get into that a little bit more. Not only is our learning outcomes saying that students investigate, it also is indicated in the skills and procedures with different verbs, such as predict. If you did the materials unit or the matter unit, they were testing materials. That's an indication of a scientific methods being brought in. Explore. Explore isn't just going and playing. It's an informal investigations. They can still make predictions. They can still observe. We see observe in our curriculum as well as investigate and examine. So the specific sample that we're looking at today, and the reason I chose it was there's not a lot of skills, but the one that is in there is conduct an investigation. How is that different than just investigate? Well, we have our glossary here, and it says conduct means to engage in the process of planning and carrying out. So if you think of a conductor in a symphony or an orchestra, they're behind the scenes planning and arranging how this will be executed. So it's the same thing if you look in our investigation cycle, planning the investigation. So there will be a guided process. So if you did the unit bouncing balls to bandages, the students were involved in the planning of the investigation. So the expectation in conducting is they're definitely going to be part of that. So the resource that you're going to receive today, the planning guide, is for integrating the scientific methods. Has a title page like this, but it is a PDF. These steps are all linked so that you can just look at it digitally, or if you prefer to print it out, you may. But in here, we'll have the sample of light in the middle, and then there's guiding questions. So if you go forward, so let's say for sound, that's there to help you, or other organizing ideas. There is a toolbox that is linked and changes depending on the phase. So what's linked is the Science Verb Glossary that I just referred to. Some of you may be aware that ARPDC has put forward what's called a CPAR, Curriculum Planning and Assessment Resource Document, with lots of different resources that are linked. CMAST, if you're not aware, is the Center of Mathematics and Science, Technology, Education at the University of Alberta. They have a wonderful site, so at certain planning phases, I have that linked, as well as blank planner templates. So this planner guide wasn't just sort of out of my head. It was based on evidence and research. Our tried and true understanding by design, or keeping the end in mind, as we often hear from Wiggins and McTighe. But not only that is teacher clarity and the impact. I think that came out of John Hattie's meta-analysis over a year's worth of growth of impact on our students when teachers have clarity and our students are clear. And so this teacher clarity playbook actually was primarily a really tool in terms of the sequencing, as well as the hot off the press was Improving Primary Science. That was a report out by the Education Endowment Foundation and out of the United Kingdom, and they did an international sort of research on best practices in primary science. So those are integrated into this planning resource as well. So this planning resource about focusing on clarity, it starts with unpacking the curriculum. And I know we feel like we have done that, but it might be looking at it in a different way. And it's also thinking about that sequencing from the perspective of the student, that they're going on a learning journey from the beginning, middle, and end. So our lessons are building on each other. Okay. So we're going to unpack that together. So in the first step is analyze the learning outcome to identify the skills and concepts which direct the how and what of our summative assessment. So we know that, right? We know this is what we're summatively assessing. So here I've attached energy and scientific methods. That you will be attaching the scientific methods, and you will be summatively assessing more towards the end of the year. I've seen some resources out there specific to our curriculum in science that have unit tests in scientific methods. It's not something I would do because they are applying the scientific methods because that's how they're building knowledge in the other organizing ideas all through the year. And I think I had sort of a voluntary touch point, and some of you came to that. And we're realizing that developing questions, for example, for the purpose of an investigation is going to be a year-long process. So kind of keeping that in mind. So the guiding question is, what concepts or nouns or science ideas that do students need to learn? Well, they need to learn about the behavior of light and sound. We're going to focus on light. And then in the scientific methods is investigation itself. So they started learning that in grade 1. Now we're unpacking it a bit deeper, looking at how it's influenced by purpose. Then what you want to do is look at your verbs, because that's what you're assessing. That's what students demonstrate what they know and understand and can do. Here we see investigate. So it's all through investigation that students will be demonstrating about the behaviors of light. And we're going to look at that example, or behavior of sound. And then I examine investigation as well as explain its influence by purpose. So if we go to the glossary for the verbs, for examine means to carefully and in detail consider the characteristics to find out about it. Explain is hugely important in science because science is about understanding why or how something happens. So it's giving a reason for it, for the cause or why it's happening. So next, what we're going to do is, now that we've analyzed the learning outcomes, the next step is to examine the CUS to identify important concepts. So the learning outcome, as we know, is very broad. And so we know that the CUS kind of break it down. So we're going to sort of see what and skills that will demonstrate successful learning. So you can see here, this is for light. Our guiding question is what concepts or nouns or science ideas and the knowledge and understanding statements are integral to student learning. So I color-coded here, behaviors of light affect its path. And you can see that I started to move the knowledge statements and the skills around to kind of line them up. And CMAS does a great job of that, by the way, to help you out. But what I did here was path was kind of green, and I did that for source of light. We know include means that we have to teach, that the students need to learn that the sources of light are the sun, electricity, fire, and some plants and animals. But behaviors of light's pretty broad. What does that mean? So if we go in our knowledge statement, light behaves in various ways, I've color-coded all the ways that it behaves: travel, bouncing, bending, splitting. Those are all movement. And in grade 1, so those of you who do a 1-2 split, in grade 1, they're learning about movement of objects. So in grade 2, behind the scenes implied here is they're learning about the movement of light and the movement of sound also. But you can see I've lumped in this light travels through objects that can be seen through, because it's all about the behavior of light. And now, actually, when we get to the sequencing, you're going to see that affected by mirrors, prisms, and water is all kind of interspersed through here. And this skill is attached over here. Now, the path of sunlight can be affected in a variety of ways by natural objects. Now, we know such as means it's a sampling. You don't have to do all of them. And I've color-coded those natural objects. So what I want you to do, and this is not pretty intense, and if you don't have access to a chat, that's fine. I'm just going to pause for about 1 or 2 minutes. I want you to look at the verbs, and I want you to tell me, what verbs should I circle? What should I be looking at for what the students are going to do? So I'd like you to take a few minutes to drop into the chat just the word itself. Just tell me what word I need to circle. Now I kind of gave you a hint. I gave you 4 circles. So if you can just drop in the chat 4 verbs that I should be circling from that our students are going to have to demonstrate. Okay, I want you to focus on the skills right over here. Okay, not the knowledge statement, just the skills. Because the skills are what we're formatively assessing. Okay, awesome. Great work, you guys. Okay. You guys were on the money. Identify. Conduct, to determine, okay? Because conducting an investigation means you need to do it for a reason or a purpose. Why? To determine how the path of light can be affected. And examine. Awesome work, you guys. So our students need to identify sources of light. They need to conduct an investigation to determine the path of light, and they need to examine. So we need to know, what does that mean? So we've already talked about examine, so I'm not going to. But we know identify is pretty straightforward. It's like name, verbally, written, match, recognize by naming or indicating, right? So that's what our students need to do. They need to recognize the sources of light by naming or indicating. Determine. And so it says conduct an investigation to determine the path of light is affected. Determine is to find a conclusion. Now let's look at using procedures. There's a lot here because math also has the same verb. We don't have to worry about calculations in elementary, but to find a conclusion using reasonable procedures, well, those procedures are the scientific methods. So they have to come to a conclusion. They have to say what it means. And we're going to kind of unpack that a little bit further. So now that we've analyzed the learning outcomes and examined the cusps related to that, to kind of go, what are the ideas that our students are working with? They need to know, but also they need to do with the verbs, right? Identify, conduct, and examine, determine. Now we want to make sure that we connect those ideas from our curriculum to foundational science ideas. And so in order to determine the essential science ideas for teacher clarity to enhance student learning, and also determine potential misconceptions to consider when teaching and assessing. So our kind of guiding questions for this is what terms and science ideas do I, as a teacher, need to understand? And what do I need to learn more about or refresh my memory? Okay, it's been a while since I learned about refraction, okay? And what concepts in this learning outcome are connected to the previous grade, which I talked about movement, and what science vocabulary might be used in a non-science context that may potentially confuse students. And I have force and reflection. We're going to get into that. So there's a lot of writing here. So I'm going to unpack this a little bit more about some of these ideas. Now, I want to sort of talk to you about the parentheses. So when I had some training with Alberta Education, I asked this question specifically for this particular unit about it says in parentheses is for the teacher. And I said, well, what if we taught like the term refraction or dispersion or reflection? And what I was told was that if that is for the teacher to look up, and there's some reasoning behind it, and we're going to talk about that today too. But if you're teaching those terms, you're kind of going off the curriculum because the skills and procedures do not ask the students to use those terms. And that's for us to use and look up. Okay, so we'll kind of go into that a little bit more. So I pulled off this quote from the Connecting the Curriculum to the Science Ideas. We're going to kind of unpack it a little bit so we can see it. But what came out of some of the research is that, knowing about these science ideas in a little bit more depth is great for us, but it's not enough. What we also need to be aware of is student misconceptions, where they might be challenged. And we're really familiar with math in that area or language arts, but we acknowledge that there hasn't been as much professional development in elementary science. So we have to be aware of that. So we're going to talk about that now because it may make understanding, this is kind of that explore and explain phase. Some of the terminology might be confusing for students, and we're going to get into that a little bit more. Okay, so what came out of that report, and I learned a big word, but I knew about this idea, is that there's some science words that are used in everyday language, but have kind of a double meaning. Everyday language meaning and science meaning. I guess they're called polysemous words. Really, what you need to be aware of with those words is things that can be used in like force, for example. Students can confuse that because when they hear the word force, I'm forcing you to do something. But in the science term, we know that means push or pull. So out of this report, they talked about different tiers in these polysemous words, but they're not like our tier one, like from ELAL. They're everyday words like push pull. Then there's words across the science disciplines. Those are like scientific methods like predict, compare, observe, describe. And then of course, then specific to the organizing idea itself would be things like magnetic or bounce would be in this particular piece, okay? So I'm saying you need to be aware, but in your little toolbox, there is a site. It's from the United Kingdom called Explore. It's wonderful. It's called Tackle the Tricky Bits. It's linked. So light is in there, but I've pulled a lot, and we're going to talk about that today, but sound is in there. So there's some, not all. CMAST is putting that together as well. So it's in progress. So go back and check. And then I just want to point out that the National Science Teaching Association, nsta.org, you do not need a membership. You can search. Paige Keeley's formative assessment probes, they're usually for American, but if they align, they do have some indications of the misconceptions. So let's get into this and unpack this a little bit more. So students are supposed to determine or come to conclusions about how the path of light can be affected, that light travels in a straight line. So there's, luminous objects or the sources of light, such as the sun. Some are natural or artificial. But if you remember, was that in the knowledge statement or the skills and procedures? No. So you can do that if you have time and you want to teach the kids about natural or artificial light, but I wouldn't assess it because it's not part of our curriculum. Light is given out from a source, so that's why we start there, in all directions, and darkness is the absence of light. So one of the areas for misconceptions actually is students think that because they've never really experienced complete darkness, that your eyes will adjust. But if it's really dark out, then you actually need light to see, but they've never experienced that, especially in urban settings. So we'll talk about that as well. The second piece is determine how the path of light can be affected by different surfaces. That's the knowledge statement, and that light bounces off surfaces. So we see light directly, right? But how we see objects like this apple, and this is for us, not our students, is that light we know it goes off in different directions, and some of it will bounce off and go back into our eyes. Sort of like down here with the smooth and rough surfaces, why we see shiny surfaces. This was a huge challenge for students. What came out is that a lot of times, this is the term reflect. What they're used to on a day-to-day basis is mirror image, or in math, that can be reflect. So what they suggested in the research is use the term bounce. That's indicated in our curriculum because there's 7. And so that was sort of, I think, why our curriculum is going in that direction. Students often confuse shiny objects as emitting light. So that is something we'll go through, and they'll need multiple exposures to light bouncing off various surfaces like colored paper, a flower, a baking pan. And when we do bring in mirrors, because we have to in our curriculum, they said do that towards the end. And that students should draw and label and record that path of light, right? Because they're going to be reflecting back on that to draw their conclusions. Okay. So here's an example, and I know this is I think grade 4. However, I do think grade 2 could either draw the source of light, or you could give it to the student, they glue it in, but I really think that they can draw the path and how it's reflecting off the surface. So you could put the terms on the board, and when they go and make their observations, they can use and label their terms. Okay, so they should be demonstrating their own understanding first before we give them videos or text, and we'll see a sample of that as well. So now we're going to move towards determine how the path of light can be affected as it bends from one material to another. So when light enters the air, it slows. When it goes through other materials such as water and plastic, like the prism, it slows even more, and it turns and it changes direction. Usually it just goes in a straight line. So what students need, they don't need to know all of that, but what they do need to do is see the path of light and see that it's changing direction, as you can see up in this particular prism. So lots of hands-on experience for them to manipulate and see the changes with a prism or with water in a mirror. And we'll go through that as well. So I'm going to pause for a minute, and I'd like you to kind of just think about, so when we talked about our TQS, that we choose activities or resources that accurately reflect our curriculum and even the way that we assess, Think about this. We're talking about light bends as it travels from one material to another. And which hands-on investigation do you think will best help students to determine how the path of light is affected as it goes through water? We have number one, which is all over Pinterest. And then we have number two. So take a moment to look at these Giphies and see which is going to help students come to a conclusion how the path of light is affected or changes as it goes through water. Just drop in the chat what you think. Right. That's why I chose number two. That's what you're going to get a link to this particular hands-on investigation. It's really simple and straightforward. It is a clear glass of water with milk and a laser light. You can get laser lights at the dollar store or Walmart or wherever, in partners. And I would set the clear glass, it could be plastic. I would have them without water, without anything, put the laser light through straight, tilt their hands, and kind of see. They're going to see that the laser light's going to shoot up, right? And then number one is refraction. And I've seen resources out there connected to our curriculum use this, but how is the student determining the path of light? This is an American resource that is actually a phenomena that students observe and have to explain, and they talk about angles of refraction. Too complicated. We'd have to explain it to our students that this is happening. If you choose to do this activity after as an extension, by all means, go ahead. But just know that that's not something we would be assessing at a grade 2 level. So finally, we're getting to the last skill or knowledge statement about determining how the path of light can be affected and splits into different colors. So the path of light is affected by water and prisms. So this is very touchy. We can see that here happening, and that's what our students are going to be observing when we're recording. This is for us, not our students. This is what happens when light goes through, it refracts. This is how a rainbow is formed. It changes direction and then reflects out and splits into its actual colors, because light is actually made up of all these colors, as we know. So again, it's because they're determining the path of light, so they're coming to that conclusion is what determine means, then it means that they need hands-on experience to make those observations, record and reflect on those observations as well. This is rhetorical. You don't need to drop in the chat, but I do want you to think, because I have seen this on Teachers Pay Teachers, and I've seen this connected to our curriculum on other resources. They have the kids sort, reflect, and dispersion. I think that it's not what our curriculum's asking, because what that's doing is testing whether or not they know that term. And later, maybe in in secondary or later on, they're going to have to come back to, and they probably will, and learn deeper and more about it. But what we're looking at is the path of light and having them to observe and see what is happening to the path of light to determine and come to that conclusion. So I hope that clears up and allows you to do what we're supposed to do as professionals, which is reflect our learning outcomes as well as for assessment. Okay, so now that we've connected that to, what is our curriculum asking and what are the science ideas behind that, now comes to the planning phase itself of develop learning progressions that kind of go, where am I going with my students? How am I going to map this out? They're not lesson plans, because one progression, like step one, and don't worry, the next screen will kind of show a close-up of this, could take 3-4 lessons. Okay, for our students to develop and understand. But the guiding question here is, how will the concepts and skills be combined? So they've been separated in our curriculum. Now we're going to bring them back together and put them in an order. And then how will students use explore before explain? So how am I going to integrate those scientific methods to build the knowledge? So I've kind of separated steps and skills, as you'll see in a moment. Linked here is this resource document, so you can kind of see the cyclical process of the procedures. And then what resources, this is when you actually bring in resources. What resources would support student learning engagement with both the explore phase and the explain phase, okay? And on the side here is a sample plan that you're going to receive for today for light, and then a blank plan or template to use in other organizing ideas. So we went through the CUSs and we talked about this, and the skills is what we're watching and formatively assessing on. What I've done then, they're not, as I said, not lesson plans, but I've ordered them. Okay, now they kind of similar order, but I have moved some things like I've combined them. Identify sources of light include sun, electricity, fire, and some plants and animals. Conduct an investigation to determine the path of light travels in a straight line and then travels through the objects that are see-through. And kind of put that there. So do they need to know transparent? It's not in our curriculum. Okay, it's hard. There are a lot of resources. I was looking for the videos and things after. All of them mention it, so it's not bad. You just don't need to assess that. Students don't need to write and say transparency. So we know about conducting investigation to determine, and then I went from the straight line. They're going to, investigate bouncing off of surfaces affected by mirrors and examine the natural objects. I bring that in as well. We know about there to continue on with that conducting investigation. Now it's bending light, and I attached affected by mirrors, prisms, and water. Down below, we know they're conducting an investigation to determine the path of light is affected by splitting into colors. Again, I bring in the prisms and the water, okay? So what you're gonna see now is where I've started to, and you're gonna get a full-on plan for this, is I brought in resources, but I looked at the steps here. So I did sample lessons. Okay, so you have 2 weeks worth of lessons that you, if you choose to use, you can, but you can also use these resources. So these explore just the investigations. There's no lesson attached to it. You'll have to go through to see the next. The explain, I bring in the books and the videos and things like that. But I wanted to show you, identify sources of light isn't conduct an investigation, but I still can bring in the scientific methods. So in your organizing ideas where it's not talking about conducting an investigation or perhaps in sound, they use explore, right? Explore isn't sort of playing, but it's an informal investigation. They can still do the steps of that cycle, right? They can still do their observations, predict, record observations, making conclusions, and asking questions. I do bring in one of the skills, comparing observations and data with others as an example, because they will be. Now, full-blown conducting investigation, they're going to go through all the steps, including planning the investigation. So I do have a sample lesson plan for that. And then I started expanding a little bit more on the skills that I'm going to formatively assess in this particular unit. And somebody wrote down transparency is in the matter unit, and you are absolutely correct. So you can bring that in from matter if you've taught that as well. So thank you for that. So I've repeated these steps, which I'm not going to go through because they need to conduct an investigation for the other knowledge statements, right, that have been sequenced out. So now that I kind of have an idea, and we know that we always hear about the end in mind, and I was saying to our assessment consultant, I'm like, I didn't come up with a summative task until after I went through the progress, because to me, I'm just going to go back a bit. We need to start with the source of light first. Then how does it travel? It bounces off surfaces. And then as it goes with other surfaces, it bends and changes directions. Okay. So I came up with a summative, so then at any point you can flip between the two, but you want to determine evidence of success of what the students know, understand, and are able to put into action in an unfamiliar or real life context as a result of learning in this unit. That if you've taken sessions with Chris and Ted, that transfer of learning or application in a new context is your summative assessment. So your guiding question is, sorry about that, is how will students, it says insert the verb, and you'll see an example here. How will students investigate? So the verb is investigate behavior of light. how can I use the understanding statements to develop summative assessment? So as you're going through these units, as I mentioned, you're summatively assessing along the way. How are they applying certain pieces or aspects? So the verb glossary is there if you need it, and the sample rubric is there as well as a blank rubric. So I'm going to show you the summative assessment tasks that you get with this particular plan. So where I found this, and I thought this would be a great one, is using they're going to build an obstacle course for light. So using knowledge built over the investigation about the behavior of light, students create an obstacle course that ends with the light splitting in colors. So the criteria, this just got slightly cut off here, but you'll have a copy of this. The criteria is that the light travels in a straight, they have a source, obviously. It travels in a straight line and goes through material. That's 2 criteria there. They use a mirror to change the direction of the path of light. And then it ends with splitting in colors with either using water, because there is an investigation with a mirror and water to make a rainbow, or prisms. Now, I did see in the computer science skills about using precise words and pictures and diagrams so that others can follow your instructions. And I thought, what a great way to integrate that and develop those recording of observation skills. Because the purpose of recording an observation is for us to, the scientists, reflect back on, but also other scientists use it. So why not have them record it, and then their partner has to recreate that obstacle course based on their directions or instructions from the diagram. So what you receive, and then here is I mentioned to you, this is the progression. So these are the explore and explain resources linked that go in the order in the document that are linked here. And then you're ready to do the instruction piece. Now you're ready to plan the lessons because you've got a sequence in which you're going to unfold. So creating meaningful learning experiences. So to plan for instruction that is cohesive from the student's perspective, being strategic and sequencing lessons that build on prior knowledge of learning, as well as having the potential to extend their thinking. So the questions here is, what underlying prior knowledge do they need to have from the previous grade? Movement is one, but we're going to talk about a bridging lesson for this year, but it could be review. How can I access what students' ideas do they bring? So there's a bit of a pre-assessment. We're going to look at that sample lesson. How can I minimize those potential student misconceptions that we've talked about? And where can I integrate cross-curricular connections? So in my session in September, I talked a lot about you're developing vocabulary. They're going to be reading or watching videos and using text forms and structures or comprehension or oral language, a lot of that think, pair, share, and discussion. So you can use some of your minutes there, because if you feel, you can apply some of that into your science as well. What do I want to hear or see from students during the lessons that demonstrates the progress of the skills and procedures? That formative assessment, right? We got to keep all those kinds of things in our minds. So now I'm going to, at this part of the session, I'm going to talk about the sample lesson plans that are included. So as I mentioned, I developed the sources of light, which is approximately 3 days with a bridge or review lesson. And then the second one is conducting an investigation that light travels in a straight line. That's about 5 days of lessons for that particular piece. So I put them all under one lesson, but I say day 1, day 2, day 3 kind of thing. So in my session in September, I did talk about a learning summary table, but in my session, I kind of adapted it a little bit differently, where the students had to, they're developing, gathering data to answer a question, but it's kind of the same thing. I'm going to actually use the learning summary tables. So this one is in my classroom. I use this in grade 4. And so you talk about the activity. What did we observe? What did we learn? And how does it help us? And then what vocabulary do you have? If you don't have room in your classroom, you could use a Google slide. I do have an example of that here. I liked this particular teacher's sample learning summary table because it had some pictures of the investigations, small scale investigations they did. Okay, so formative assessment, this is a checklist, or if you used it in the previous session from Matter, you can add in energy as you see at the bottom. What I did here was I put in the skills and procedures from the energy organizing idea, as well as the science methods and computer science, because we should probably be building towards that. And then you can change these to met, not yet, or approaching. And you can just write about this. You don't have to write about every student. It's up to you. But, you know, if the student that is struggling, so that you have that piece of evidence in case you're questioned, that's there. And then sound is after. I didn't put it in, but you may want to put it in after as well. That's linked in the document. So the lesson plan format that I created is very similar to the other one, except for I moved the formative assessment at the top. Because I feel that by the end of day 3 or so, what do I want to see or hear, right? We have that triangulation of evidence. We don't just want to give quizzes. We want to observe. We do the great job of that in primary. We watch our students in our lessons. Like formative assessment and instruction are like this. They're married and helps inform our instruction, but also listening to our students talk. What do I want to hear from them? And this is about 3 days. So the sources, identify sources of light, you know, that we have what it includes here, but assessment look for it. That, what do I want to hear or see? Can students identify and label examples of different sources of light? Can they sort objects that are sources and not sources of light? So I bumped that up slightly to distinguish. I mean, I know it's identified, but in order to separate it, they need to identify first. So we'll talk about that. And of course, we're formatively assessing our scientific methods and their observation skills, specifically in the area of description. If you were in the summer symposium, you know that students struggle, lots of people struggle actually, with you know, distinguishing between observation and a conclusion or an inference. So slowing students down, and we'll kind of have a conversation about how to do that. So this lesson or the unit launch begins with, have you ever been somewhere where you couldn't see anything and you woke up at night? So this is accessing some prior knowledge. And 5-minute think, pair, share, nothing too deep, but it was from that Explorify site. Quite liked it. I thought that was an interesting sort of getting into it, because we talked about how students haven't really been in total darkness. So what I found was a mini dark box. And so you can have that with an object that students can maybe look at, but they can't shake or touch. And at the end of the lesson, you'll reveal what it is. Can you see it? Can you describe it? Do you know what's in there? Meanwhile, while you set that up, this is something that students can do with partners. And it's a shape box. Sorry, if someone can turn their microphone off, please. Thank you. A pinhole box. So this came out of a book on Get Epic on what are light waves. So students would work in either a small group or partner, and they'd have a shoebox and they'd put some objects in it, have a hole at the top, and students would observe it without light. So in the classroom, it would be dark. It's not going to be completely darked out, but what they're noticing is the difference between the absence of light, and then they observe it again with a flashlight. So you will need flashlights for this. Onto the whole, what can they record, what they can see, the difference. Okay. So then what you want to do is poll your students and have a whole class discussion. You know, what did you observe when without the light? And you can make a T-chart and record this. What did you see with the light? And then talk about what was different, why, you know, and then have them, what makes you think this, kind of prompt them a little bit. And you always kind of want to end it with some I wonder questions, because we're going to use those to start to go back to for potential investigation questions. So day 2 of identifying sources of light is you're going to show them, and you get the slides as well. You get all the resources for this. These are pictures, and you say, what do these 3 pictures have in common? And more than often than not, they're going to say light. You don't have to have that question up above, but just what do these three pictures have in common? They're going to say light. Now we're going to add light source. Okay, what's different from light and a light source? Well, we're going to read to learn today. We're going to find that out. So again, you can, what I love to do is Freyr models. So you can create this as a whole class chart. And you're going to say, okay, we're going to find out what light source means. So help me find the definition for that. And, so you can get a student friendly, and characteristic or features are just like properties of the ways of describing that definition term, and then examples and non-examples. So how I would do it, and this is from Get Epic. So all these books are listed and they're free. So I would read page 4 and 5 is just kind of what is light, kind of gets them thinking about it. It gives some features, but page 12, and I don't read in between, I just read the pages I've listed, gives the definition. Okay, so then I would ask the students, okay, think, pair, share. What did you hear is the definition of light? Well, where light comes from. Well, do we have anything that describes these light sources? They glow, okay? But we're not done. I have a 2 or 3 minute video on sources of light. This is an excellent video. It kind of goes through, enhances the definition and description, and then it talks about examples and non-examples, which is great for our Freyr model. So then, we add that it makes its own light, and you can even add emit because they'll probably hear it and see that in books. And then examples. So this would be a piece of assessment. So they can have stickies and they can draw on the sticky and write sources of light, or, you can ask for them to list all the sources of light and then give a non-example with their name on it. I think this is kind of a short lesson. So I thought maybe, have some books available. I'm not overly assessing on plants and animals, but we have to teach it. So, get them to look for it and share with each other. What do we find out about plants and animals that make their own light? Okay. So on day 3, I found this on that Explorify site. It's wonderful. I've never seen this with science. I saw this with math. Which one doesn't belong? So these are open-ended questions. There's no right or wrong answer, but you don't really say that to them, but it opens up discussion. What are they thinking? So they can do a quick think, pair, share for 5 minutes. Which one do you think doesn't belong and why? And then share out as a class and have a discussion, and then lead into the next activity, which is the sorting of sources of light. And you do receive these they're linked as well. So you could do this students could do this independently, but personally, I would do this in partners because I'm going to ask them to have a conversation. Why is this a source of light? Why is it not a source of light? And that allows you to kind of not only observe, but to hear their conversation and hear their thinking for formative assessment. Can they identify the sources of light? And do they explain? This might be where some of those misconceptions about different things that are shiny emit light, but you will also come back to this after they do bouncing of light off different surfaces, because they might realize, oh, well, the light's just bouncing off. That's why we see it with some of these, that are shiny. Okay. So I talked a little bit about the learning summary table so that I had posted in my classroom. Canva sometimes cuts these off, but this is just the activity or small scale investigation. What did we observe? So it was dark, it was gray, without the light, right? We want them to describe, because that's an observation. And then with the light, we saw colors of yellow, and I saw black tires, and the shapes are they probably will see a bit of the shape in the darkness, but they won't see the colors as well. And then what can we learn from this? Well, we need a source of light to see things. Now, I have here, how does this help us with our obstacle course? I didn't include that here because I haven't introduced it yet, and I'll show you when I will. Again, we're done. I would have them go off and write I wonder questions, because these are great sources of what are the students, what are they wrestling with, their ideas, but also could be investigation questions as well. So that bridging lesson, we know that our students didn't learn last year about movement in grade 1. Kindergarten's where they start learning about movement. And so grade 1 is movement of objects. So in grade 2, we do, because they're doing the obstacle course, I want to start by movement, right? So what is movement? So a colleague of mine, Ted, he creates these concept attainments. And that's linked as well. I'm just going to get out of the presentation to show you an example of what it looks like. So what would happen, and he has the directions in there as well, but you would say, okay, I want you to look at these pictures, and there's some yes examples and not examples, and we're looking at what movement is. I want you to focus on the yes, and you can look at the no, but what does movement mean? So I had to go here because it's I couldn't take a screenshot without you seeing that he kind of put in some movement, right? So then they kind of talk about, what they think it is. Movement is when something changes location. But there's more to movement. And then this is position. So they have to look at the yes statements and the no statements. Well, they were moving back and forth, but they're not moving back and forth. So here, movement is also a change in position. And then so on. So it goes through, there's an activity here that you can go through with your students to kind of get them learning about what movement is before we talk about the performance task. Okay, I can get to the next page. Okay. So then you can have a discussion, you can get them to get up and move their bodies. Let's change location, let's change position, okay? Then you're going to tell them, well, throughout this unit, we're learning about light and, how it travels from a source. That's all we're going to say. We're not going to tell them how it does because they're going to find out and make conclusions about that through their observations. But we're going to do a obstacle course. And they may not know what that is, so you can show them a video. You can even get Connect Pew where they, do mini obstacle courses that they can move through. Well, do you think light moves in the same way that we do? Yes or no? And they can have discussions. They're going to learn more as they go through the unit. So then I would go back to that question and say, well, how does knowing about this light source help us with our obstacle course? Well, we need a source of light to create our obstacle course, or you could say maze, so that they're setting up the criteria as they go along for their performance tasks. So they're not at the end trying to think of all of this. So as they go along, they're thinking about their obstacle course that they have to create. So lesson 2 is the launch into conducting an investigation about how the path of light is affected or it travels in a straight line. So we know that this sort of says asking questions, but really scientists don't just ask questions, they notice something, they make an observation that makes them go, I wonder why this is happening. So we kind of want to give that authentic task to our students as well. So I pulled in from our curriculum about examining natural objects, and I used the trees and leaves. So before we begin, again, on the top of this lesson, I have my assessment look for as the students are working through, right? What do I want to hear or see as they examine how trees and leaves affect the path of light, and they conduct an investigation. Now this is, we know, 3 to 4, even 5 days of lessons to develop this particular concept. The scientific methods as well, I'm formatively assessing. So to begin with, they're shown a video of the sunlight through the trees and leaves. Now, instead of saying, what do you see? Because they're just going to say, I see trees, leaves, and a sun. Get them to slow their thinking a bit to describe what color or shapes they see before they name the objects. So you can even might want to play it a couple of times for them to observe. And then get them to say, what is happening? Like, where can we see the sun? Where can we not see the sun? And then you want to think about, well, why? So what's happening here as the sun is going through? And they'll probably say it's being blocked by the tree, because they come with some understanding, but it's not necessarily being blocked. What is being blocked? And so they'll have a more sophisticated explanation at the end. But they can draw, and then you walk around. This is your pre-assessment. What ideas do they come with already, right? You want to keep this for the end because they're going to reflect on this to see the changes in their thinking over time. So they've been asking tons of questions along the way. So then what is it we're trying to find out? And, asking questions, and we know about question sorts. So what things can we realistically investigate in the classroom? What are things that we can't investigate in our classroom? So, for time or money or things like that. So why do we see the sun sometimes and not others? And you can even put in some of these questions, but have them help you sort, because they're looking at developing questions for the purpose of an investigation. So now they're going to start looking at answering that question of why that happens, and they're going to get an investigation with flashlights and two tubes, empty paper towel. They have to be long, not toilet paper. I've tried this out. And 2 tubes is important, taped together to an end of a flashlight, and then one is bent, okay? Now this is about how the path of light, how does light follow a path and what is its path? Because in grade 1, they're learning that objects follow a path, right? But the light follows a path, but light's not an object because it doesn't have weight. It's not matter either. So I do connect that idea of path, right? We talked about movement or movement path. So this marble, when we drop it through the tube, how is it going to travel? What path is it? It's going to go straight. What about if we move it through the bent tube? Is it going to follow? Is it going to bend? Well, you'd have to give it a little bit of force of dropping, or does it come out at the end when I turn it? It'll pop out, right? What about light? What if that's the question you would ask the students. What about light? If I attached it to the straight tube, how will it travel out or move out? What about, will it move around the bend and follow the path of a bend, right? And so then they go and they make their predictions because they're going through. This one isn't the full-on planning because there's 2 explorers here for a reason. And the second one, they're going to get involved in the planning. Okay. So then they record their observations. And then verbally, the conclusions are the learning summary table, right? So what did we observe? And then, oh, this is not the one I wanted. Let's just check. Sorry, that should say, that we observed the light going straight out. It is attached to your lesson. And then what can we conclude? That light follows a straight path, but it doesn't turn or bend if the path does. Okay, that's the path of light. Now, they do go off and ask more questions, okay? And then now we're going to get into the conducting of an investigation. And it's going to be probably something you might have seen on Pinterest or around or in grade 4. This is the one investigation that I could use from grade 4 only. So you can review their questions. You may get something like this. And if you don't, you can offer this as an observation on your part. So last lesson, we saw that light does not follow a path that's set out or curve. It only goes through straight paths. Johnny, or you could say I, wondered if light moves around objects when its path is blocked. So they started to build some knowledge about how light moves, and it doesn't follow a path. But does it move around an object? That's a great question. What do you guys think? So get the discussion going. Okay, let's find out. Let's investigate. We're going to be scientists. So what are we trying to find out? Well, if light will change direction and move around an object, right? That's why we introduced movement. And then help me write the question for this investigation. So this could be a guided practice. So I'm going to begin with Will. Will light, can you think, pair, share? How could you finish that? And how could we create a question? So that guided practice for writing a question. Will light turn and change direction when blocked? So you could get a few ideas from them and kind of help craft a question for the developing of the purpose of an investigation. So it's the one with the cards, the index cards with the holes in them. I'm sure we've all seen that one. And so you're going to say to them, okay, we have these like this is them helping you plan the investigation. We have holes in the cards, and if we line them up and we light the flashlight, will it go all the way through? What do you think will happen if we put something, an object, or block it? Well, do you think light will turn and change direction and move around it? let's predict. And they'll probably, you know, well, like think about what we learned about the tube, like light traveling down a path. So let's plan this investigation. So what, you know, they have to know in the knowledge statement, it talks about how investigations that are repeated, they get the same results. Well, this is a fair test. So what stays the same? Okay, the flashlight, the size of the material and cards, and the size of the holes. What are we observing? We're observing, like really make sure, because we can't take this for granted. We're observing how the path of light travels, if it will move around an object. Determining, that's the skill, determine if the observation meets the purpose of the investigation. What changes? One card will not have a hole, right? Because we're going to place that in front to block the light. So they also need to describe the steps of the investigation. So that's left here. These are the teacher samples. So, you know, the kids can work in partners, or you could have it written up on a chart. You know, this is your choice. And then they fill it in, or they fill it in with you of what they're going to do. So that's day 1. Day 2, they're going to make their predictions. Okay, so they might need a little bit of a refresher on the second day. And then they're going to observe through all the holes are lined up. Okay, so in the graphic organizer, I couldn't quite get the cards like this, so you may want to draw that in, and then little holes, and the students can draw the path of light, right? They're determining the path of light, so they need to observe and record it. Then in the second part, they can either pull the card out as it is here, or put a card without holes at the very end. Then they record that and draw the path of light. So then in the learning summary table, so the purpose of doing this is to get them to draw their conclusions. That determine how that determine means to draw conclusions, right? So here we have our small investigation. So, you know, we want to know, why is this, you know, the tree, thinking about the tree, they're going to come back to it, right? So light did travel. This is about the beam of light with the tubes. This is here where it is. Light traveled in a straight line, it did not curve. But here is the hole punch. So when the cards were hole punched, the path of light moved through the holes. The one card moved, the light path of light didn't move around. So what did we learn from this? That light travels in a straight line, and even if it is blocked, it follows its own path in a straight line. It doesn't curve or bend. It doesn't move around objects. How does this help us understand why the sun, we can see the sun in the trees at times and sometimes we can't? Okay, so we gave them that. It's not just a provocation. We want to come back and get them answering that as those scientists would. So they should, something like, the sunlight through the tree and leaves, the sunlight in the trees travels straight, but it could not move around the trees or leaves. So that's why it appears to be blocked. It doesn't really stop either, because light can get absorbed into opaque objects, as we know. Okay, so can we connect this to our performance task? Well, we need to know in our obstacle course, they've already said we need a light source. Well, now we need to have our lights travel in a straight line. So they're going to add to that as they learn through the lessons. How is this helping us, you know, making those connections back so that they really are thinking? So you would do a think, pair, share in this particular piece. Okay, so those are the 2 sample lessons that you're going to get. And in the planner unit, which I will share in the chat in a moment. But the key ideas that I hope you walked away with today is that the science methods are meant to be integrated into all the other organizing ideas. Second of all, it is the way in which students should build their knowledge and be given the opportunity to make conclusions and confirm those conclusions with videos or text. Having teacher clarity and taking that time to really unpack what the verbs and what our curriculum is asking enables you as a professional to accurately choose activities that accurately reflect and align with our curriculum, so that you can assess that as well. And that developing those learning sequences helps you then create lessons that you can kind of intentionally plan and align the scientific methods with. And that you've got the planning guide resource to help you go forward and develop that in different ways. So I really do want to thank you for coming out today. And I'm going to share in the chats some of the resources so that you have them. I'm going to share the planning document as well. There, chat, and then I'm going to stop recording. I'm just going to put this in the chat too. This is, I'm going to show you, so linked in the planning document is, this is the resource that you receive. So here is a table of contents of where you can find the assessment checklists and things like that. And then here you'll see the sequencing. So I gave you 2 lesson plans, but here you have, if you click on these, you're going to have access to the different, just hang on a moment, I'll get to your question. You're going to get access to all the hands-on investigations. Okay, let me try this again because you should be able to, everybody has access. Yeah, anyone with a link has access. Okay. I'm going to stop recording. So now's the time if you have questions.